So I'll talk about the players in the landscape, and I'll talk about the interconnections really between the players through the lens of the value chain that we see in the market. And I'll take that value chain all the way from silicon chips to enterprise organizations such as are represented in the room today, and everything in between. As both Andrew and Robbie have touched on, when we're working with customers, our starting point is to help to understand the business goals, sometimes the business challenges, in conjunction with a deep understanding of the technical possibilities, so that we can jointly identify the solutions that are going to drive real business value. And to get that understanding right on the technology side is pretty important, because you don't want to overreach and think that too much is possible, but nor do you want to underreach and be overtaken by other people who realize what the technology can do in a way that you've missed. So that's pretty important. Now, right now, the technology space is on fire. It's very, very dynamic. And we think within that dynamic environment, it's pretty important to understand really, how to put it, I suppose the interests and the positions of the various players. It's interesting to do that, but it's also very commercially valuable to do that. And we would actually say it's commercially vital to do that you can find yourself taking some steps that you might subsequently feel trapped by if you don't understand who's in the market and what are their real motivations, how can they help, but also what are they trying to do. So I'll move on and introduce 6 buckets really. So we're dividing it up into these 6 buckets. And the names on there, the lists on there, aren't meant to be exhaustive, but they're meant to give some sense of the value chain as we see it and the flow of value through it. And the starting point, I'll go with chips. And the obvious, I suppose, is it obviously the obvious interests. Sorry, I'm just going to make this a bit bigger for me here. The obvious interests for the chip makers, well, they're trying to create very, very high performance chips for the AI market, so that they can be used for AI model training and for inference. Monetization, well, they're going to sell those chips to the people who are running or servicing those AI workloads, in particular the cloud platform vendors and also the people developing the foundation models. The position, well, it's a highly concentrated market. In fact, we say chip manufacturers, the leading player by far in this AI chip space is NVIDIA. I think everybody knows that. With about 90% of the share of chips being used at the moment for AI build-out, infrastructure build-out. Why do they have that grip? Well, for many years, they've been developing their position of not just, I should say something about, they're not manufacturers, they're designers of chips, and the manufacturing, the fabrication is being done by TSMC. And that's the case for many chips these days. So they're designing cutting-edge chips. They have been for a number of years, but they've also got very good software that is now the preferred choice of the foundation model developers for being able to exploit those chips. They also have very good networking technology to connect these chips together into effectively clusters of supercomputing power. So it's not a simple grip that they've got, it's a pretty strong grip, evolved over a long time. And at the moment, the market is heavily concentrated around NVIDIA. That said, AMD is clearly playing to catch up and to get a bigger chunk than it currently has, but so are the cloud platform providers. So are Microsoft and Google and Amazon getting into their own chip design, with fabrication again being done elsewhere. What else to say about it? There was in 2023, in the sort of immediate wake of ChatGPT coming out, a supply crunch, really, a shortage. It was difficult to get the supply of the chips, but that's, and you'll see in a subsequent graph, that's been solved. So the supply constraints have fallen away. This is the part of the value chain where the money is being made at the moment. So in other parts of the value chain, people are investing very heavily, but the recipient of a lot of that investment is NVIDIA. Just put their results out today or yesterday. Don't know where I am in the world, but very good results, continuing in line with analysts' expectations. And this put NVIDIA in a place now where it's probably the second most valuable company in the world, but way up there. The DeepSeek point that Andrew put on the timeline there, 20th of January, caused a bit of a stir. And some people in the financial markets asked the question, would this DeepSeek breakthrough and the more efficient use of processing power, would that somehow change the trajectory for NVIDIA? And the jury's out on that. I mean, there are some people would argue that more efficient technology will need fewer chips, but other people argue whenever things get more efficient, the long-run cost drops and the demand increases. So jury's out, seems to be not affecting anything in the short term. So NVIDIA is doing well. It's doing very well, and it's doing very well in a way that's backed up by real earnings, real sales. So, I mean, this graph looks too good to be true, but it is their quarterly sales into the relevant sector, into the data center market, which is the thing that's driving everything at the moment. And we'll see other parts. Let me put this paper down. We'll see more about that in a minute. But the time scale here, so the first quarterly bar on there, November to January 2022, and the ramp up starting in May to July 2023. But that first row of flat bars, sub $5 million per quarter. And then by the time you get to around the middle of 2024, triple that, more than three times that, 15 million a quarter, and then higher, triples again. So that's relevant. We'll come back to that. The cloud service providers, well, what are their interests? Well, they're about building out cloud computing capability, essentially so that your organizations, all of us, rent it in some way. So we're not buying hardware anymore. We're not buying software anymore in the same way. We're renting cloud capability, cloud processing, cloud data storage, cloud data transfer. The position they're in, though, is that they're having to make massive capital investment. That's obviously part of the game, the normal progression of cloud. I think Microsoft, in its most recent results, said its cloud business had grown by 30%. So that's pretty big growth that they have to be investing behind. But in addition to that, the next waves of growth are going to be driven by people adopting more and more these very processing intensive AI models. So they're having to invest ahead of that, and having to invest ahead of it for fear that if they don't, another of their competitors will be ahead of them. So Microsoft is looking at Amazon, is looking at Google, and then there are some other consumers as well. So Meta is a big player in this space, not because it's selling cloud space or cloud processing power to us, but it's selling advertising to everybody. So big investments going in. The second bullet point on that position box there, they obviously need to drive customer value to generate the revenues to get payback on those investments. Otherwise, they're going to have made big investments that sit there on their balance sheets being depreciated in their P&Ls and bringing their profitability down. So they have to somehow drive usage. And there's concern about the degree to which they're investing. Are they investing ahead of a demand that will materialize or won't materialize as quickly as they think? And some of these headlines are from November when we ran this event in London, but it carries on in the same way today. Financial markets worrying that perhaps there's an overinvestment. The graph on the right-hand side here, you can see, reflects the investment that was going in anyway before ChatGPT, but then a little bit of an adjustment and then a steady ramp up, a pretty dramatic ramp up. A lot of that investment being spent on NVIDIA's chips and the rest of the things that go into putting data centers together to house and operate and run those chips. Whatever the concerns of the financial markets, this chart updates what we just saw for information that was put out by Microsoft and by Google and by AWS and Meta in their recent January results. And these are January results that came out after the DeepSeek news. They're not backing off their investments at all. You add up the size of the column there, 320 billion expected to be spent this year by those four players alone. So they're not worrying about it in the same way that the financial markets are. They're saying, we're going ahead. We believe there will be demand there. Meanwhile, back in September 2023, a guy called David Kahn, who works for Sequoia Capital, and Sequoia Capital, some of you might know, a very now long-established venture capital provider in Silicon Valley, really at the heart of Silicon Valley, behind some of the big technology stories of the last 20 years or so. But David Kahn wrote a paper in which he'd done a relatively straightforward back-of-the-envelope set of calculations to say, given the run rate of expenditure on these specifically NVIDIA chips at that time, what would the future demand have to be to get a payback on those investments? And his answer to that at the time was $200 billion. So you can read the thing there. The important question to be asking, how much of this CapEx build-out is linked to true end customer demand, and how much of it is being built in anticipation of future end customer demand? Now, this comes very relevant when we get to our bit, your bit of the value chain here. But I'll just build on one more. The same person, David Kahn, updated that same analysis in June 2024. And you'd seen from the graphs, the investment had continued. So by that stage, the same thought process said, well, in fact, there needs to be about 600 billion of revenues being spent on this technology. How much is coming? Well, with the latest release of financial information from Microsoft, for example, they're saying their run rates have reached $13 billion. So obviously a massive amount, 13 billion is a lot of money, but a long way short of 600 billion. So what are the others doing? Well, in many ways, Microsoft is a leader in terms of the direct monetization of this space. Meta would say they're doing very well on their investments because they're getting good payback through their more efficient use of advertising in the world. But generally, there's a big gap between what David Kahn would say needs to be spent, if he's right, and what's actually being realized so far. The next block, really, foundation model developers, what are their interests? Well, to make sure that they're making absolutely cutting-edge models. They're in competition with each other. And you will see in a minute the dynamic is if you produce a model, you can price it if it's a good model. If it gets overtaken, your pricing power drops. And so it becomes less valuable almost straight away. Heavy investment required to build the models. But if you hit it, you can price it. If you get overtaken, your pricing power drops. Monetization, well, they're licensing their models. They're giving API access for fees. They're using token-based pricing. So in many ways, when you're putting information into one of these models or getting output from it, they're measuring words or near words. Tokens would be the accurate thing. And pricing tends to be in terms of tokens. And in many cases, they're revenue sharing models where we're collaborating with the cloud platform providers or other people. And in some cases, the models are being put into the open source community and monetized in more indirect ways. or less direct ways, I should say. The position, well, it's very rapid development, very rapid competition between these developers. Open source is increasingly posing a challenge for proprietary developers. So, what's going to win? Is open source going to prove to be more innovative and just move faster than proprietary developers can do that? And new models drive down prices. So our reaction, and you'll hear it recurring through the morning and through this presentation, optionality is important. It's really important to keep your options open. Here's something about the intelligence and speed and pricing of the models. In the intelligence section here, it's a measure of an index value that's trying to assess how good the models are in terms of the quality of their output. And generally, the higher the bar, the better. The middle section is talking about the speed of the models, and it's measuring it in terms of output tokens per second. So effectively, words generated per second. And the higher the bar, the better, because it's faster. At the far end, price, all other things being equal, the small bar would be better, because if everything else is the same, you'd want to pay as little as possible. But an obvious characteristic on that last price bar, one very, very expensive model at the moment, OpenAI's O1 model. Andrew talked about it, very big model, a reasoning model. And you pay $26.30 per million tokens going into that model. DeepSeek is also on there somewhere. Am I allowed to walk? DeepSeek, $1 for its reasoning model, R1. So big price disparities. That's one of the reasons that the 20th of January, just one of the reasons that caused the stir. If you look at them in terms of how well they're rated in intelligence, O1 and DeepSeek next to each other on that chart. So both pretty effective in that sense. Look at the middle section, DeepSeek, slower than, well, in fact, O1 isn't on there, but O1 Mini is on there. So not all of these models are equal, and you certainly can't assume that they're equal in terms of price. Now, every so often, or any time, you can sort of delve in and say, what's the cost of running these models on any particular platform? So many of the models are available on multiple platforms. I'll zoom in because it's almost impossible otherwise to read it. But if you focus on this particular Llama 70B model, available, and look at the input column, that's the price per million tokens going in. The same model available on different platforms at very different prices. AWS, $2.65, Azure, $2.68. Well, they're clearly keeping an eye on each other's pricing. Databricks, $1. Snowflake, $3.63. So marking it up a little bit. If you think you're just, okay, I've got the platform, I'll just use this model. Perhaps worth shopping around, particularly if you're going to be running these intensive workloads. So the AI development tools, my colleague quite often does this presentation and she says how much she likes Hugging Face, but who can help but like Hugging Face, lovely logo, but French-American company that produces really something that developers can use to find their way around the plethora of offerings that they might want to use when building machine learning and AI models. But these development tools generally getting better very quickly, many of them open source or from open source foundations, and enabling developers to see out of a whole range of things what they might want to use and integrate into their developments. Enterprise analytics platforms, well, at the bottom of that box, Microsoft Azure, AWS, Google Cloud. Each of those providers is obviously trying to provide something that offers capability that is good to use, easy to use for serious enterprise purposes. But they're also trying to make it as sticky as possible, that if you're on their platform, you stay on their platform. Whereas Databricks, Snowflake are overtly doing something to make offerings that work across any and all of those platforms together if that's necessary. So they're giving you multi-cloud coverage with a common layer. They do it in different ways. So Snowflake comes at it through a very traditional, from our point of view, a traditional relational paradigm. Databricks, not at all. Comes through a much more modern Spark paradigm, born really out of the big data era, but big data done fast. So quite different in their philosophies, but fundamentally achieving something similar, which is a layer that we can use to keep us independent of the underlying cloud platform, if we want to be cautious about that stickiness. Back to the Sequoia Capital guy, David Kahn. So he warns really that if you look back in history, when something new surges, as these foundation models are, these generative AI models are at the moment, there tends to be a race to invest, and in that race, some incineration of capital. Now, effectively, you get some winners out of these races, but not everybody is a winner. If you think back to the dot-com boom, same thing happened, a massive overinvestment in infrastructure, some very, very important companies born in that era, Google, Amazon, how would we live without those? And they were born in that boom, but a lot of things didn't flourish in the same way. But his point is more of an economist's point than a technologist's point. He's saying, go back to, say, the railroads first being developed. There's this overinvestment at the beginning that results in an overcapacity. Not everybody wins, but end consumers win because the cost of it brings dramatically down the cost of this infrastructure, and we can use that to innovate. So from our point of view, if you're an investor, you have to worry. If you're investing through Microsoft or through Amazon, you have to worry, are they overdoing the bets they're placing? But from our point of view, we don't care if it results in something that's good for us. So he goes on to say, really, that the infrastructure build-out is going ahead at pace. The tools are getting better. The AI foundation models are getting better. This all now depends on the last mile, the consumption that enterprise customers and normal people get out of this. So it's for us really to think about the opportunity to channel this thing. Now, he also uses an analogy that's not on the slide, but he says in any industry where there is very heavy capital investment required, and his analogy is the airline industry. To operate an airline, it's expensive to buy the planes. It's expensive to have the landing and takeoff slots at airports where you're going to service routes. But having made those outlays, any extra seat that you sell on a plane, as long as you're covering your marginal cost, you'd be mad not to fill that extra seat and make a contribution. So in that kind of capital-intensive industry, and he makes the parallel between this, what's going on here, and airlines, it's always worth pricing cheap at the margin to get the extra seat filled. So we, as potential users, can benefit from that effect here. Massive investment going in, but it's to our advantage, as long as we keep our options open and don't get locked in with the wrong thing. So to us, really, or to people in this room, in enterprise organizations, our interests, well, monetization, whatever our interests are, and that's what we need to work out. How are we going to use this? How is it going to be monetized? Well, by perhaps increasing revenues or decreasing costs or improving our regulatory compliance or any number of things. The position that we find ourselves in, there will be push and pull pressures. So some pressures to adopt AI for fear of disruption if we don't, or because we're drawn to some possibilities that we think are too good to miss. So there'll be push and pulls, and there will be a backdrop of other players in the value chain pressuring for their interests to be met. And it's important that you keep your interests in mind. That they need a particular thing from you is not the issue. It's what do you need out of this infrastructure, and how do you get your best way. And the best way is to keep your options as open as possible. So I'll leave it at that, or I'll hand back to Andrew at that. Think, what are your interests? Keep your interests to the fore. Don't let somebody else distort your interests. Monetization, increasing revenue, decreasing costs, improved customer experience, regulatory compliance, cost optimization, opportunity identification, productivity, any number of things, but they will be specific to your organization and your business functions.